Do you want to activate your body's natural reset button? Do you want to hit Control-Alt-Delete on your health? Well, prolonged fasting can lead to reduced inflammation, improved immune function, and it can prolong longevity. So, today we're going to talk about prolonged fasting, going to teach you about the science and how it affects your health. Let's go. Welcome back to Citizen Surgeon. My name's Dr. Eric Pearson, and today we're talking about prolonged fasting. We're building on the last video, or the last couple of videos, where I talked about treating aging and intermittent fasting. So today we're talking about prolonged fasting, which is really the next step for calorie restriction. And it can be pretty extreme, and I'm going to talk to you about that. So what is prolonged fasting? Prolonged fasting is if we have calorie restriction for greater than 48 hours. Now, under 48 hours, we talked about, that's intermittent fasting. So that could be time-restricted fasting. Now, for me, I do a 16-hour window of fasting just about every day. You could also do alternate day fasting, so 24 on, 24 off, 24 on, 24 off. And those are all intermittent fasting. So check out that video if you want to read about that. Prolonged fasting is caloric restriction for several days to weeks. And this could be extreme, and we're going to talk about this, as in water-only fasting, or Buchinger fasting, which allows a low amount of calories every day. So we're going to talk about those two methods. All right. So importantly, you have to approach prolonged fasting with more caution than intermittent fasting, especially if you have comorbidities, if you're on certain medications. Children and adolescents should certainly not do prolonged fasting. If we have heart failure, if we have diabetes, we want to approach this with extreme caution. So if you are going to undertake prolonged fasting after watching this video today, make sure to reach out to your physician, see if you would be a good candidate. But let's get into it. So what are the two major types of prolonged fasting? Well, one is water-only fasting. Okay, so no calories, no extra electrolytes, just 2 to 3 liters of water every day. Now, if we do that, what effects can we expect? Well, 0 to 24 hours, we're going to be burning that glucose and that glycogen. And after 24 hours, we're going to have depleted all of our glycogen stores. Well, what happens at 24 to 48 hours? Here we're going to get beginning of our ketosis and increased fat metabolism. Between 48 and 72 hours, this is where our autophagy, or getting rid of those senescent non-functional cells, reaches its peak. And we're also going to have a ton of anti-inflammatory effects that are going to occur in this window of 48 to 72 hours. Between 3 and 5 days, we get stimulation of growth hormone, we get regeneration in our immune system, and after 5 days of water-only fasting, we are in deep ketosis. And this is where our body is catabolic, okay? We're breaking down these nutritional building blocks. And this is where we can get lean muscle loss. We can also get severe electrolyte imbalances. So at this point, we have to be very, very cautious and under medical supervision if we are indeed doing a prolonged water fast. Now, what is this Buchinger fasting? I might not be saying that correctly, but this was developed early in the 20th century by Dr. Otto Buchinger, who was interested in doing research on prolonged fasting. And this involves taking a low caloric beverage, that's 200 to 300 calories, usually vegetable broth or something like that, that is going to give us low amount of calories as well as our electrolytes. And that's going to allow, or the thought was that this is going to allow fasting, however, safer, so we don't get as much catabolism and we don't get as much electrolyte imbalance. So what are the key phases of Buchinger fasting? In the first day, we get digestive rest. Between 24 and 48 hours, we begin ketosis. We've now depleted our glycogen. Between 48 and 72 hours, we're getting increase in that autophagy. Now, this is not as drastic, this isn't as severe, or maybe even not as effective as in water-only fasting, because we are giving ourselves 25 to 35 grams of carbohydrates, and we are giving ourselves 200 to 300 calories. So we're not getting as dramatic of an increase in our ketosis or autophagy. Between 3 and 5 days, we're going to get increase in growth hormone. So growth hormone would be stimulated. And then after 5 days, we are in ketosis. We're going to get stem cell activation and increase autophagy. So those are the key phases of the Purkinje fasting. But now I want to get into the physiological changes that occur when we do water or low calorie fasting. Well, first is glycogen depletion, and that takes about 24 hours. If we're doing physical activity, that might happen quicker. After we've depleted our glycogen, our adipocytes are going to release free fatty acids, and then we're going to be using ketones, so acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate as our primary fuel source. So what about these ketones? Are the ketones physiologically beneficial? Well, they are, all right? So what effects do these ketones have? So these ketones, acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate, can have a range of physiological benefits. And some of these are to decrease cardiac and vascular inflammation. This can result in a decrease in blood pressure, and that's a beneficial effect. We also get a decrease in appetite. They plateau right around 5 to 10 days, and we see through upregulation of AMPK pathways and downregulation of mTOR pathways, and we talked about that in the intermittent fasting video and treating aging video, we can get increased sensitivity of our insulin receptors. And so that's important when it comes to glucose regulation. And so now that we understand the physiological effects of prolonged fasting, let's get into the actual changes that happen to the body. Well, how about body weight? How does body weight change when we look at prolonged fasting? Now, if we look at this graph, we can see that we get the most dramatic change on our body weight in the first 5 days of prolonged fasting. And then we start to plateau off as the fasting interval increases. Now, one of the problems at looking at body weight is that we are losing not only fat mass, but lean mass. Now, if we look at individuals who are water-only fasting, and we look at a time point at 8 days, the average body weight lost will be 6 kilograms. Now, 2 kilograms of that will be fat, but 4 kilograms of that body weight loss will be lean mass. So we get changes in not only body fat, but in lean muscle mass when we do water-only prolonged fasting. In these same studies, if we look at a 10-day time point, we're going to have 7 kilograms of total body weight lost, and 3 kilograms of that will be fat, and 4 kilograms of that would be lean muscle. So if we're looking at prolonged fasting, extreme caloric restriction in a water-only fast can produce a significant amount of lean muscle loss. And that may be one of the benefits of a Purkinje type fasting. Now, what happens to that weight lost when we resume eating? Well, 30 to 50% of that weight is regained in the first 48 hours, and that's just water and glycogen, okay? The rest, the 50 to 80% of weight is eventually regained, and this can be limited by not binge eating when we start eating after our fast, and by starting back on a healthy, balanced diet. If we go back to our previous behaviors, before the fast, then virtually all the weight is going to be regained, and that is consistent in the literature. Now, when we talk about body weight, can we get into fat loss, and specifically, what type of fat loss is most needed? Well, then we have to ask ourselves, what type of fat is the most dangerous? And the most dangerous type of fat is visceral fat. And typically, men have more visceral fat than women. So check this guy out on the couch. He looks like he's got a ton of visceral fat. And visceral fat is pro-inflammatory, and it is bad for nearly every aspect of our health. Now, visceral fat is very metabolically active. Now, that means, number one, that it's going to be fairly responsive to prolonged fasting. But it also is the reason that visceral fat is so bad for our health. So releasing inflammatory mediators, releasing adipokines, this can contribute to metabolic disease and atherosclerosis, and is one of the reasons that we want to get our visceral fat percentage down very low in the single digits. Measuring visceral fat, the gold standard is MRI, but we can also do that by waist circumference. So in a lot of the research in prolonged fasting, waist circumference is used as a measure of visceral fat. Now, when we do prolonged fasting, it's visceral fat because of its high metabolic activity that is preferentially used for a fuel source. And if we continue intermittent fasting after a period of prolonged fasting, we can keep visceral fat at bay. If we go back to a high calorie, high carbohydrate diet, visceral fat can return quickly, and that is going to be pro-inflammatory. So if we're going to use prolonged fasting as a tool to reduce visceral fat, it's important to use intermittent fasting in periods after that to keep that visceral fat at bay. Well, how about blood pressure? How does blood pressure change when it comes to prolonged fasting? Well, after 2 to 3 days of prolonged fasting, we can get significant changes in our blood pressure. Now, this is primarily through decreased sodium intake, the release of naturally uretic peptides that are going to promote sodium loss, and activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is going to relax our blood vessels and decrease our blood pressure. Well, we can get a 9 to 14 millimeter mercury change in our systolic blood pressure to decrease, and a 6 to 13 degree change in our diastolic blood pressure. So this could be significant. If we're walking around with a blood pressure 140/90, which would be defined as hypertensive, we could get down to 126 over, let's say, 77 or right around there if we just did prolonged fasting. Now, what's the bad news? In the studies that I've reviewed, the blood pressure changes that we see in prolonged fasting usually return to the pre-fasting state on resumption of the diet. So it's primarily due to that natriuresis, decreased sodium intake, and also the effect of ketones on the blood vessels that are going to reduce our blood pressure. Now, there are some diets like the DASH diet through Mayo Clinic. I'll put a link to that in the description below. But the DASH diet is a type of diet that is heavy in fruits and vegetables, also low in sodium, and that can have a long-term effect on reducing blood pressure. Now, how about cholesterol? Cholesterol is pretty interesting because when we look at LDL and HDL levels, if we look at, let's say, a 7-day fast, we may see 10 to 15% reductions in our LDL. What happens at the end when we resume our diet? If we go back to a pre-fasting diet that was unhealthy, high in fat, high in cholesterol, we could have return to our baseline levels. If we maintain intermittent fasting, have a healthy, balanced diet like the DASH diet, then we can have sustained reduction in our cholesterol. Now, how about glucose, insulin, and insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance when it comes to prolonged fasting? Well, if we look at glucose first, in obese individuals that have fasting glucose at 90 to 100 milligrams per deciliter, prolonged fasting can get that down to 85 milligrams per deciliter. Well, what's happening? Well, remember, at 24 hours, we're going to have depletion of glycogen, and we're going to immediately reduce that fasting glucose level. Well, why doesn't it drop to zero? I mean, we're not taking in any sugar, so what's happening? Well, after 24 hours, we're going to get gluconeogenesis. We're going to make glucose, and we're going to do that from amino acids and glycerol, and that's going to allow us to maintain a fasting glucose level at around 85. Now, how about insulin? If we look at insulin levels are reduced by 65 to 80% by days 3 to 5 of prolonged fasting. And more interesting is insulin resistance. So if we look at insulin resistance in obese individuals, we see that resistance decreases by a third after several days of prolonged fasting. Now the question is, what happens after we resume a diet? Because eventually we got to start eating again. Well, if we resume a high carbohydrate, high sugar diet, then these levels will return to their pre-fasting levels. However, if we can maintain a healthy diet, perhaps continue intermittent fasting, we can have sustained reduction in our insulin resistance. And that's really important. That's why we talk about prolonged fasting as a reset button. And why are we having changes in our insulin resistance? Part of that is by upregulation of AMPK pathways or mTOR pathways being downregulated, but we're actually getting changes in that insulin receptor, and that is really critically important when it comes to fasting glucose levels and how hard we're really pushing our pancreas and those pancreatic isolates to produce insulin to get those glucose levels down. Now, one thing that's critically important is this right here. Now, that is a nasty looking liver. And what's wrong with this liver? Well, this liver is diseased from non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD, is when greater than 5% of the liver is of fat. Now, this is very common, and the global prevalence of NAFLD is 30%. Now, fatty liver disease has a ton of consequences, whether this is increased vascular inflammation, increased atherosclerosis, increased cardiac inflammation, the list goes on. So we want to both reduce visceral fat, which we talked about, and we also want to reduce fat in the liver so we can get rid of NAFLD. All right, now, after 48 to 72 hours of fasting, we can get a significant reduction in liver fat because this is also very metabolically active. And why are we getting that? We're getting that because with severe caloric restriction, we're going to get increased fat oxidation, and we're also going to have decreased triglyceride synthesis. So we're not going to get fat deposition in the liver, in the viscera, or in subcutaneous tissue. It's not just prolonged fasting that can have a dramatic effect on liver fat or visceral fat, but intermittent fasting can as well. And one good study showed that after 12 weeks on an intermittent fasting regimen, liver fat can be reduced by 20 to 30%, and that can have significant benefits to our health. So another awesome power of prolonged fasting. Now, can this be sustained? Well, a couple of good studies demonstrated that, again, if we're going to return to a high-fat diet, we're going to get return of that visceral fat. But if we continue intermittent fasting, if we have a DASH or a Mediterranean diet, we can get sustained reductions in liver fat for over a year. Now, a lot of you might be thinking that I'm not ready for prolonged fasting. I'm doing intermittent fasting, and I want to try it, but are there any benefits to a 24-hour water fast? Well, the answer to that is yes. Okay, so there are a ton of benefits. You can see some of those right here. All right, so autophagy activation, improved insulin sensitivity, reductions in blood pressure, growth hormone stimulation, having an improved lipid profile. It's been seen time and time again that we get improved mood and improved mental clarity. We have better emotional regulation by incorporating 24-hour water fasts into our routine. We're also going to have some caloric deficit and fat loss, especially if after the fast we resume a healthy, balanced diet. We see reduction in inflammation and enhancement in our immune response. So even incorporating just a 24-hour water fast into your routine, maybe once a week or a couple of times a month, can have significant health benefits, not only for our health now, but when we look also at longevity. Well, now the question you might be asking is, hey, do you do it? And I do water fast, and this is exactly how I do it. So I aim for one 24-hour water fast a week. And I usually start this after lunch on a Sunday, and I'll keep that going until after lunch on a Monday. I found if I have a nice healthy lunch early in the afternoon on a Sunday, and it has vegetables and a good amount of fiber in it, that's going to keep me satiated, and I drink water the rest of the day. Wake up on Monday, have some coffee again, more water, and I don't really get hungry again until Monday afternoon. And so that's how I incorporate it into my week. I'd be curious if you've tried water fasting or Buchinger fasting, and if you have, let me know how this has affected you in the comments. Well, I hope you enjoyed that today. We talked all about prolonged fasting, talked about the physiological changes that happen, whether it's water fasting or having low-calorie fasting, like that Buchinger method. Then we got into all the effects on the body, so body weight, visceral fat, blood pressure, cholesterol, glucose, insulin, insulin resistance. Talked about all of it. I'd love to hear your concerns or questions about fasting, but this is that one thing that I try to put into the week right on Sundays to incorporate that and get those benefits for longevity, and not only longevity in the future, but my health now. So thanks again for joining us. As always, stay safe, study hard, work hard. I'll see you next time.